The war in the Pacific was being fought in the open daylight, at least at first. Through 1942 and early 1943, both the U.S. Navy and the Army Air Forces believed that the tropic sun was their greatest ally. Radar was still a fragile curiosity, confined to the decks of destroyers or the noses of heavy bombers. But the darkness, those long, star-drenched Pacific nights, belonged to Japan. Under the cover of black water, convoys slipped between islands, carrying fuel, munitions, and the lifeblood of the empire's distant garrisons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In a small workshop at Northrop's California plant, a handful of engineers studied an ungainly machine that would one day turn those nights into hunting grounds. It was big for a fighter, almost bomber-sized, its twin engines and twin booms stretched around a bulbous cockpit. They called it the P-61 Black Widow, the first American aircraft designed from the ground up to fight at night. Yet before that name struck fear into Japanese convoy commanders, there was another aircraft, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which carried the experimental radar that would prove the concept could work. Records from the U.S. National Archives and the Air Force Historical Research Agency tell the story of those early experiments. In the fall of 1942, engineers at Wright Field began fitting the British-made AIMK-4 radar set into a modified P-38. It was crude and unreliable, its green cathode screen barely visible in turbulence, but it could see in the dark, an invisible beam sweeping from metallic echoes in the sky. The 339th Fighter Squadron, under 13 Fighter Command, volunteered for testing in the Pacific. The pilots were skeptical. "You're asking me to chase a ghost," one of them wrote in his debriefing report from January 1943. By that point, the Allied codebreakers had already begun flagging Japanese night convoys running between Rabaul, Bougainville, and Truk. They carried the fuel and ammunition feeding Yamamoto's island garrisons. Traditional daylight air attacks were costly. By night, the convoys moved untouched. If radar-equipped fighters could find them in darkness, it would change the arithmetic of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cardenas, later a test pilot at Edwards, remembered those early nights as flying through ink. In his training notes, preserved in the 13 Fighter Command records, he described how the radar operator, usually a navigator pulled from bomber units, would guide the pilot solely by voice: turn 10 left, target bearing 020, range closing. The pilot never saw the sea below, never saw his target until the gunsight flashed against black water. The U.S. Navy's H-Gram 018 describes a crucial technical turning point in February 1943. Engineers replaced the British set with an American-built SCR-720 radar, giving sharper range and azimuth. The Lockheed testbed now had something revolutionary, a radar capable of detecting ships and aircraft several miles away, regardless of weather or light. To the Japanese, radar was still an enigma. Their own airborne sets were primitive, and convoy commanders trusted human eyes and discipline. Orders from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary from March 1943 warned only of enemy reconnaissance at dawn. No mention was made of radar interception. They could not imagine that an American fighter could track them in total darkness. The Black Widow program was still months away from production, but the principles were already tested in combat by those early P-38 crews. They hunted alone, without visual contact, guided only by flickering radar screens and the trust between pilot and operator. Each mission was an experiment in courage and machinery. By April 1943, the concept was validated. Convoy losses mounted at night, and Japanese reports described mysterious attackers striking without warning or visibility. In those moments, the Pacific's darkness, once their shield, became their undoing. What began as a laboratory experiment had become a doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces had discovered a new way to fight. In the unseen hours between dusk and dawn, the sky itself would whisper the enemy's position. The age of the radar hunter had begun. The men of the 339th Fighter Squadron learned quickly that darkness was its own enemy. The Pacific nights were deep and absolute, no moon, no horizon, no line between sea and sky. Even experienced pilots found themselves vertigo-stricken, flying by instruments that lagged seconds behind reality. In such a place, 1 second of disorientation could mean a dive into oblivion. Official 13 Fighter Command training reports, dated February to March 1943, describe the painstaking regimen that forged the first night radar crews. They flew endless circuits over Guadalcanal and New Georgia, climbing into pitch blackness to practice blind turns and radar-guided intercepts. The men called the missions ghost hops. The radar operators, often borrowed from bomber units, sat hunched over glowing scopes the size of dinner plates, tracing faint blips that might be a Japanese transport or might be sea clutter. Lieutenant Thomas Red Brannan, one of the first to master the technique, recorded in his logbook. The screen jumps like static on a bad radio. But sometimes, you catch a heartbeat out there, a pulse moving when nothing else does. That's when you know it's real. The training combined cutting-edge science with primitive survival. The AIMK-4 radar was mounted behind the nose cone, its operators seated aft with only voice communication to the pilot. The two-man teams developed their own code words to cut through static and fear. Ghost inbound meant contact. Firelight meant visual confirmation. Every radar intercept required perfect trust, a single misread could send them chasing phantom echoes or colliding midair. According to declassified Air Force Historical Research Agency notes, radar instructors from Britain's Royal Air Force arrived in early 1943 to share combat lessons from Europe. They stressed patience and discipline, skills foreign to the Pacific's aggressive fighter culture. The Lightning pilots had to unlearn their instinct to chase targets visually. Now, they stalked by instruments, creeping unseen into gun range before firing short, surgical bursts. During one early exercise near Espiritu Santo, a pair of P-38s practicing intercepts nearly collided. Both pilots bailed out, their aircraft vanishing into the ocean. The tragedy forced a pause in training, but it also hardened resolve. Night flying was no place for amateurs. If you could survive the first 10 missions, one radar operator later said at the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion, you could survive the war. Maintenance crews faced their own learning curve. The humidity-corroded circuits, salt air ruined connectors, and radar calibration required night after night of adjustments. Ground technicians joked that they spent more time drying out radar boxes with hairdryers than sleeping. Yet when it worked like magic. By mid-1943, the 339th's radar flights were integrated into broader 13 Fighter Command operations. Convoys of Japanese barges and coastal freighters often moved at night between Bougainville and Rabaul. Intelligence from intercepted radio traffic, confirmed by Allied translator and interpreter section analyses, gave estimated times and routes. The radar lightnings launched in pairs, climbing into the black sky to find them. The Japanese had no idea such a thing was possible. Their night air patrols relied solely on visual contact and signal flares. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary for April 1943 noted repeated unexplained air attacks between 2300 and 0300 hours, the first hints that the Americans were hunting in darkness. But for every success came failure. The early radar had blind spots, sea clutter could mask ships, static storms made scopes unreadable. One mission report from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater, recounts how a Lightning crew tracked what they thought was a freighter for 30 minutes, only to discover it was a thunderstorm cell. Still, the confidence grew. The radar operators became specialists, revered by their squadrons. They were the eyes of the night. One after-action debrief put it best. We no longer wait for dawn. We bring it with us. The groundwork was laid. The 339th Fighter Squadron was no longer experimenting, they were ready to hunt. And somewhere beyond the black waves, Japan's supply lifeline pulsed like a vein waiting to be cut. By the spring of 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected the art of night movement. Convoys crept across the Solomon Sea under blacked-out skies, their engines throttled low to avoid phosphorescent wakes. Lookouts, perched on steel masts, strained their eyes against starlight. They trusted silence, discipline, and darkness more than any mechanical device. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, preserved in the U.S. National Archives, details the doctrine of these convoys. Movement under cover of darkness remains our shield against enemy bombers. No illumination permitted. Visual watch doubled. Radio silence absolute. The Japanese believed that night was their ally, the one element Americans could not yet master. Their naval strategy depended on it. Each convoy, usually 8 to 10 transports, escorted by destroyers and submarine chasers, carried vital cargo, aviation fuel, ammunition, rations, and fresh troops for the island garrisons. Without these lifelines, Rabaul, Truk, and Bougainville would wither. The convoys departed from Palau or the northern Philippines, hugging the coastlines and weaving through narrow straits. Zigzag routes, unpredictable schedules, and strict silence made detection difficult. American reconnaissance flights saw little but ocean. From daylight altitudes, the Pacific seemed empty. But by night, beneath the clouds, Japan's supply lines pulsed steadily. To guard them, the Japanese relied on experience, not electronics. Their air patrols, float planes and twin-engine G-4M Betty bombers, scouted ahead by moonlight, sometimes dropping flares to check for Allied submarines. Radar was still in its infancy within the Imperial Navy. A handful of ships carried crude Type 21 or Type 22 surface radars, but they were unreliable and limited in range. Convoy commanders often switched them off, fearing they could be detected. Captain Shigeru Matsuda, a transport escort commander later interrogated in 1946 by Allied intelligence, admitted, "We did not believe the Americans could find us at night. If we were not seen, we were safe. We thought radar was only for the big bombers and ships. That assumption would prove fatal." American intelligence officers of 13 Fighter Command and the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, had begun piecing together convoy routines from captured documents and decoded signals. Each route had a rhythm: departure around sunset, arrival near dawn. It was predictable if one could see in the dark. The new radar-equipped P-38 Lightnings, soon to evolve into the P-61 Black Widow, would exploit that rhythm with devastating precision. Japanese convoy doctrine emphasized speed during daylight and stealth at night. Destroyers would zigzag aggressively by day, then reduce speed to avoid propeller cavitation after sunset. Lookouts rotated hourly to prevent fatigue, using binoculars to sweep the darkness. Signalmen used hooded lamps for communication, visible only from a few hundred meters. It was a system built for human endurance, but not for invisible technology. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater later reconstructed several of these routes. The report noted that between April and August 1943, convoys traveling from Truk to Rabaul faced mounting losses from unidentified nocturnal air attacks. Japanese survivors often described hearing engine noise before seeing tracers, sometimes never seeing the attacker at all. At first, the Imperial Navy attributed these ambushes to surface torpedo boats or submarines firing rockets. The possibility of airborne radar-guided attacks was dismissed as Allied propaganda. Only after multiple sinkings did Tokyo issue new orders. Convoys were to alter routes every third voyage and deploy flares at the first sound of aircraft. But the darkness that had once protected them now betrayed them. The flares only made them targets. Pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron later recounted how Japanese ships, illuminated in panic, appeared like glowing silhouettes through the gun sights. Japan's reliance on visual detection was rooted in pride as much as technology. In a 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, former Japanese officers reflected bitterly, "We trusted the eyes of our sailors. We did not trust machines we did not understand." And so, as the convoys continued to move through the black Pacific nights, they carried with them not just supplies, but a fatal misconception. They believed the night still belonged to them. They did not know that, above those same waters, American radar screens were beginning to pulse with their reflections. The hunters were coming, silent and unseen. The first radar-guided interception of a Japanese convoy came on a moonless night, May 12, 1943, over the Solomon Sea. It began not with sight, but with sound. At 22:47 hours, the engines of two P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron roared to life on Guadalcanal's Marston Mat runway. The lead aircraft, codenamed Ghost Lead, carried an experimental SCR-720 radar, its nose filled with unfamiliar electronics. Lieutenant Thomas Red Brannan flew the plane, his radar operator, Staff Sergeant Leo Winters, hunched over the glowing green scope that would guide them into history. According to the 13 Fighter Command debriefing report dated May 13, 1943, the mission's objective was to locate and harass a Japanese convoy believed to be en route from Rabaul to Bougainville. The intelligence came from decrypted radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, fragments of a larger puzzle. The radar-equipped P-38s were to patrol along a pre-calculated line, extending 80 miles out to sea, where the convoy might cross under the cover of night. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At first, the scope was nothing but static. Brannan leveled at 6,000 feet, throttling back to conserve fuel. The Pacific below was an abyss, empty and featureless. Not even the stars could help you out there, he later recalled. You just had to trust the voice behind you. At 23:26, Winters' voice broke the silence. Contact, bearing 180, range 8 miles. The faint echo was steady, distinct from sea clutter. It was moving at roughly 10 knots, too slow for aircraft, too regular for a weather return. A ship. Or several. Brannan banked south, radar guiding them through the black void. At 5 miles, the target multiplied, 3 returns now, maybe 4. A convoy formation. This is it, Winters said. We've got them. From the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater, analysts later confirmed that the radar return corresponded to convoy TA-9, consisting of 3 transports escorted by 2 destroyers. The convoy was bound for Bougainville, carrying 1,200 troops and supplies. At 23:41, Brannan dropped to 1,500 feet. The radar signal brightened. Through the gun sight, the horizon suddenly glowed faintly, the faint outline of ship silhouettes against phosphorescent water. He flicked the safety off. The twin 20mm cannons and .50 caliber guns thundered to life. Tracer fire slashed through the night. A moment later, a secondary explosion erupted aboard one of the transports. A fuel barge struck amidships. The entire sea lit with orange flame. Winters shouted, "We hit her!" Below, Japanese crews scrambled in confusion. Lookouts screamed orders. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary recorded the incident tersely. Enemy aircraft attacked from darkness at 23:45. No warning, no visual contact. Believed surface torpedo boat or submarine. They never knew it came from the sky. Brannan pulled up sharply as anti-aircraft fire burst around them. The radar operator's headset crackled with static, the green scope overloaded by reflected signal from the burning ships. As they turned for home, the fireball of the stricken transport faded behind them, leaving only the black. The mission was brief, just under 2 hours airborne, but it changed everything. The 339th's after-action report noted. First verified radar contact and engagement on enemy shipping achieved. Visibility 0. Visual confirmation of hits from flame. Enemy fire returned ineffective. Within days, word spread through the 13 Fighter Command. Radar had proven itself not as a laboratory toy, but as a weapon. The Pacific night was no longer Japan's sanctuary. In Tokyo, analysts at the Imperial Navy General Staff dismissed the incident as coincidence, perhaps an American destroyer raid. But a pattern was forming. Over the next month, 3 convoys vanished without trace, all during moonless nights. Japanese naval intelligence officers noted the strange timing, describing the attacks as phantoms without faces. To the men of the 339th, those missions were nerve-shattering. They flew blind, often over hundreds of miles of ocean, trusting a fragile screen and a compass. Yet every successful intercept fed a quiet confidence. "We'd come back covered in salt spray," Winters later said at the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion, "and the boys on the ground would ask if we saw them. We just smiled and said, no, but we heard them die." That night in May marked the beginning of a new era. For the first time, darkness had turned against Japan. And from that moment on, the Pacific would never sleep again. By mid-1943, the Japanese night convoys that once slipped invisibly through the Solomon Sea were being stalked by something they could neither see nor understand. Reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet described a disturbing pattern: ships attacked in total darkness, gunfire coming from the sky, explosions without warning. The term whispered through radio rooms and wardrooms alike: Yami no Teki, enemy of the dark. The Americans knew their new advantage was fragile. Every successful radar intercept risked exposing the secret. The 13th Fighter Command and 339th Fighter Squadron were ordered to keep radar operations classified even within their own units. Only select pilots and radar operators were briefed on how the system truly worked. The rest were told simply that new navigation aids had been installed. But secrecy could not stop progress. The success of Brannan's May 12 mission electrified both the Air Force Historical Research Agency and the Lockheed engineering teams back in California. By June, field modifications added more reliable SCR-720C radars to several P-38 Lightnings. The range increased to nearly 10 miles, and for the first time, pilots could track multiple targets. It was primitive compared to the radar of later wars, but in 1943, it was enough to change strategy. The Japanese tried to adapt. Their immediate countermeasure was visual, flare illumination. Convoys began carrying Type 90 illumination shells and floating flares dropped from escort destroyers. Orders from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, dated July 2, 1943, instructed: upon hearing aircraft, illuminate immediately to observe target and fire defensive batteries. But the flares betrayed them. The light silhouetted the ships perfectly against the sea, while the radar-guided P-38s waited beyond visual range, circling like sharks. The moment the sky brightened, they struck. Japanese surface escorts next tried a more desperate measure: smoke. Destroyers laid thick screens across the convoy's path to obscure it from visual attack. Yet radar saw through the smoke. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater, later concluded: Japanese defensive tactics, primarily optical in design, proved ineffective against radar-directed air assault. The use of flare and smoke illumination increased rather than reduced vulnerability. Then came the attempt at deception. Japanese engineers modified their few working Type 21 surface radars to broadcast interference pulses, hoping to jam American sets. But the P-38's radar used a different frequency band entirely. To the Americans, the jamming appeared only as faint noise on the edge of the scope, background static, easily ignored. Meanwhile, the 339th refined its own techniques. Crews discovered that radar returns were strongest when flying at 4,000 to 6,000 feet over water. They began approaching convoys at an oblique angle, using radar to fix targets before diving in visually for attack. The system worked so efficiently that 13 Fighter Command expanded radar missions to cover resupply routes to New Britain and Truk. Not all missions ended in triumph. On August 3, a P-38 codenamed Phantom II disappeared during a radar intercept. The after-action report noted the last radio transmission, target acquired, descending for visual. The crew was never found. The Japanese later reported debris washing ashore near Kavieng, a grim reminder of how unforgiving those missions were. Still, the results spoke for themselves. In just 4 months, radar-guided strikes accounted for 9 confirmed Japanese ships destroyed and 7 damaged, verified through post-war ATIS translations of Japanese convoy loss records. The psychological toll was even greater. Captured officers later confessed that crews dreaded night runs. "We prayed for clouds," said one transport officer interrogated in 1946. "The black sky was no longer our friend." In Washington, radar success reports reached the upper echelons of the Army Air Forces Board. plans accelerated for a dedicated night interceptor, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, to take over from the modified Lightnings. But for the men still flying the twin-boomed P-38s in the Pacific, that was a distant promise. They fought night after night, their radar scopes flickering with echoes of ships and shadows. Each sortie pushed technology and nerve to the edge. And above the endless dark sea, they had become what the Japanese feared most, unseen hunters who turned the night itself into a weapon. By September 1943, the night over the Solomon Sea belonged to the Americans. The P-38s of the 339th Fighter Squadron, equipped with their glowing radar scopes and battle-tested crews, were no longer experimental assets. They were predators. In the records of the 13 Fighter Command, their call signs appeared under a new mission designation: Night Interdiction, Convoy Suppression. What had begun as a gamble had evolved into a doctrine. The Japanese convoys, once confident in the safety of darkness, now moved like fugitives. Allied intelligence noted an abrupt change in enemy routing. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater recorded. By late 1943, convoy traffic between Truk and Rabaul had decreased by over 40%. Surviving vessels altered schedules to daylight hours under fighter escort, an inversion of previous Japanese practice. The reversal was staggering. The Imperial Navy, once the master of night operations, was now forced into daylight, where Allied air superiority reigned. It was a quiet, invisible victory that reshaped the Pacific War. The first major blow of this new campaign came on the night of September 11, 1943, when 4 radar-guided P-38s intercepted convoy Matsu-12, consisting of 2 transports and 3 escorts bound for Rabaul. The mission report, filed under 13 Fighter Command Debrief No. 144, reads with surgical precision. Radar contact at 2308, range 8 miles. Multiple returns. Approach vector confirmed. Target illuminated by flare discharge from destroyer. Engagement initiated. The destroyer's flare, intended to reveal the attackers, only made the convoy a glowing target. The P-38s dove in pairs. Their cannon fire tore through the deck of the lead transport, igniting fuel drums stacked on the stern. Seconds later, the second transport erupted. The radar operators logged echoes disappearing from their screens one by one. When the American planes returned at dawn, only 2 destroyers remained, circling survivors. Post-war Japanese 4th Air Group records confirm the loss. Transports Kozan Maru and Tio Maru sunk by enemy aircraft in night attack. No visual contact with enemy craft. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff was stunned. The Empire's logistical arteries, those thin blue lines across the Pacific, were being cut open by aircraft that could see in the dark. "We believed our night was sacred," wrote Commander Takeshi Tsuboi in his 1962 Symposium memoir. "The Americans stole it from us. The Americans pressed the advantage." By October, the 339th was flying nightly radar patrols not only over the Solomons but along the Bismarck Sea. New tactics emerged from experience. One P-38 pair tracked targets on radar while another attacked visually, guided by radio. They called this the ghost hand method, one hand to find, the other to strike. Supporting units soon joined the effort. Navy PB-4Y Liberators and B-24 radar bombers coordinated with the fighters, using shipborne radar to vector them toward convoys. This joint effort, documented in the Naval History and Heritage Command's H-Gram 018, marked the first true Allied integration of radar-directed night air warfare in the Pacific. Japanese counter-efforts faltered. Radar jammers proved useless, flare tactics suicidal. The Imperial Navy attempted to deploy night fighter patrols, using J-1N1 Gecko Irving twin-engined aircraft fitted with their own crude radar. But their range was short, their detection unreliable, and most were held back to defend Rabaul. None ever intercepted a radar P-38. The statistics told the story best. Between August and December 1943, 13 confirmed convoy losses were attributed to radar-guided attacks. Allied estimates showed that Japan lost over 75,000 tons of shipping to nocturnal strikes, numbers corroborated by post-war Allied translator and interpreter section analyses. Morale in the Japanese convoy fleet plummeted. Survivor accounts describe sailors refusing night duty, some begging to transfer to shore units. "We felt hunted," one officer later said in interrogation. The sea itself seemed to have eyes. The 339th's radar lightnings had done more than sink ships, they had broken a psychological barrier. They proved that darkness was no longer a refuge. Every convoy that ventured into the Black Pacific now did so under the unseen gaze of an enemy who no longer needed light to kill. By year's end, preparations were underway to replace the P-38 radar conversions with a new machine, the P-61 Black Widow. Bigger, faster, and purpose-built, it was the natural heir to the work the 339th had begun. The hunters would soon have sharper claws. But in the final months of 1943, the balance had already shifted. The Americans had turned night itself into a weapon, and Japan's ocean empire was beginning to bleed. By early 1944, the dark ocean lanes that once pulsed with the lifeblood of Japan's Pacific Empire had gone quiet. Convoy after convoy was either sunk, scattered, or forced to crawl along narrow, heavily guarded daylight routes. The Allied command recognized that a transformation had taken place, not just in technology, but in warfare itself. In the after-action reviews filed from the 13th Fighter Command headquarters on Guadalcanal, analysts noted that the radar-equipped P-38 Lightning had achieved an effect disproportionate to its number. Fewer than a dozen modified aircraft had dismantled an entire night convoy network that had once supported tens of thousands of troops from New Guinea to Truk. Their effectiveness became a case study in the power of innovation over numerical might. Colonel Thomas Torchy Hill, who oversaw the 339th Fighter Squadron, wrote in his operational memoir, "Radar changed the psychology of combat. The Japanese relied on the cloak of darkness. We turned that cloak into a mirror. Every flare they fired only reflected their own doom. The results echoed through every theater command." The Pacific Airmen had proven that radar-guided night interception could be executed from a single-seat fighter. This success directly influenced the rapid deployment of the P-61 Black Widow, the world's first aircraft designed entirely around airborne radar. When the first P-61s arrived in the Solomons in the summer of 1944, they were greeted by the veterans of the 339th, men who understood the invisible war better than anyone. Major Virgil Fields, one of the early radar P-38 pilots, remembered the transition vividly. The Black Widow felt like flying the future. But make no mistake, the Widow was born from the Lightning's shadow. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese naval strategists faced grim arithmetic. Their records, later captured and analyzed by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, documented catastrophic losses. By mid-1944, over 60% of supply convoys to Rabaul had been destroyed or abandoned. Engineers scrambled to develop countermeasures, decoy ships, smokescreen tactics, and radar reflectors, but none proved effective. Commander Katsuo Abe, writing after the war from Amori Prison, admitted, "We believed radar to be a crude instrument, unsuited for air combat. We did not understand that the Americans had fused it with discipline, training, and mathematics. That was our mistake." The impact of these early radar victories reached beyond statistics. They altered Allied strategy. With Japan's night convoys shattered, the logistical isolation of forward garrisons accelerated. By late 1944, bases in the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomons withered on the vine, starved of supplies. American planners no longer needed to invade every island, they could simply let radar and air power choke them into irrelevance. It was, in a sense, the birth of modern warfare by information. The machines didn't just fire bullets, they collected data, painted invisible maps in the dark, and rewrote the way battles were fought. After the war, the lessons of the radar P-38 were quietly folded into the emerging doctrine of electronic warfare. Declassified reports from Wright Field in 1946 credited the 339th's field modifications as the genesis of tactical airborne radar employment. What had begun with crude dials and glowing scopes now pointed toward the jet age, an era when detection, not visibility, would determine survival. Today, a single radar-equipped P-38 replica stands restored in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. Its radar dish, once a marvel of improvisation, sits behind plexiglass, small, fragile, yet world-changing. Few visitors realize that this humble instrument once stalked the black waters of the Pacific, hunting ships that never saw it coming. The men who flew those missions returned home changed. Some could never sleep in complete darkness again. Others said they still saw the green ghostly blips of their radar screens when they closed their eyes. For them, the war was never just about bombs or bullets, it was about perception. About learning to see what others could not. As Colonel Hill later reflected at a post-war symposium in Dayton, victory in the Pacific wasn't only won in daylight. It was won in the silence between heartbeats, when men trusted a flicker of light on a screen more than the eyes in their heads. The radar lightning had given birth to a new era. From that moment forward, darkness would never again belong to the enemy. By the spring of 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing under the relentless weight of Allied air power. But among the many technological revolutions that had quietly shaped the Pacific War, few remained as secretive, or as decisive, as the radar-equipped fighters that first stalked the convoys of the Solomon Sea. What began as a desperate experiment with borrowed radar sets and modified P-38 Lightnings had evolved into an entire doctrine of night warfare. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow now roamed the Pacific skies, sleek, fast, and deadly. Its twin engines hummed with confidence, its onboard radar could detect a ship, aircraft, or even a submarine conning tower miles away. But the true story, the foundation of that success, lay in the lonely missions of the 339th Fighter Squadron 2 years earlier, when darkness still belonged to the enemy. In the final months of the war, as Japan's supply convoys ceased entirely, the radar hunters were reassigned to night interception over the Philippines and Okinawa. There, they turned their craft against kamikaze formations, lone pilots diving from the stars, hoping to strike unseen. Yet even they found the sky less forgiving. The radar scopes saw them coming, faint green ghosts creeping toward the fleet. For the first time, American night fighters could intercept suicide planes before they reached their targets. On May 24, 1945, radar operator Lieutenant William Red Vaughn aboard a P-61 named Midnight Bell recorded one of the final night engagements of the Pacific War. 2 blips, low, converging, he noted in his log. Pilot turned in to intercept. 1 contact vanished. The other dove to sea, confirmed crash. In that calm, clinical language lay the essence of radar warfare, unseen struggle, waged in silence, decided by inches of phosphorescent light. When Japan surrendered in August, the men who had flown through those nights were scattered back across America, California, Illinois, Ohio, Texas. They returned to farms, factories, and classrooms, leaving behind a kind of invisible legacy. The Pacific would remember their battles only faintly, the radar towers long dismantled, the convoys long rusted beneath the waves. But for the intelligence officers who reviewed captured Japanese records, the truth was unmistakable. The Allied translator and interpreter section, ATIS, analyzing post-war interrogations, summarized the enemy's reaction with haunting clarity. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not comprehend the full use of American airborne radar until after its defeat. The concept of being hunted in complete darkness was beyond their wartime expectation. That revelation reshaped post-war doctrine. The United States Air Force, newly formed in 1947, made radar an integral part of every interceptor. Radar warning receivers, ground control intercept stations, and airborne search sets all traced their routes to those P-38s of the 339th, circling in the dark skies of 1943. In 1962, at a U.S.-Japanese aviation history symposium, Colonel Thomas Torchy Hill addressed a mixed audience of veterans from both nations. His words silenced the hall. War is cruel in the light, but in the dark, it is something else entirely. We didn't just build machines that could see in the night. We built trust in something greater than sight. And because of that, we ended up owning the night. The Japanese officers in attendance bowed deeply when he finished. For them, too, the memory was not of defeat, but of awe and acknowledgement that technology, once unleashed, rewrote the laws of survival. Today, the P-61 Black Widow rests beneath museum lights, its radar dish still gleaming faintly under glass. Nearby, a single display honors the 339th Fighter Squadron, the pioneers who first took radar into battle, not as scientists, but as soldiers willing to trust the unknown. The Pacific skies are quiet now. The sea that once hid convoys and secrets lies calm and silver under the moon. Yet for those who remember, the night still hums with echoes of twin engines, the steady pulse of radar, and the unseen hunters who turned darkness itself into their ally. In those years, Japan had never expected the Black Widows of the night to come. But when they did, they changed not just the course of a war, but the very meaning of warfare itself. The night no longer belonged to the enemy. It belonged to the hunters.